Hey there, it's Coach Mike Perry from Skill of Strength, and today's video is going to accompany a blog that I just wrote. The name of the blog is called Parts, Positions, and Prying, a simple guide to improving your movement quality. Now, when we get into the nuts and bolts of each pattern, I need you to understand something. Each drill or each exercise is not going to work for everybody, and that's okay because each person will respond differently to whatever intervention you give them. But I want you to step back and just understand the step-by-step process I want you to follow. And then I guarantee you, if you do this over time, your movement will clear up. So let's talk about this three-step system. Step one is parts. In order to move well, we need to make sure that each joint is optimized. What do I mean by that? Simply that we are doing our best to gain the appropriate amount of range of motion that we need to perform whatever exercise is coming up. In addition to that, we need to make sure that we are addressing chronically tight musculature as well, such as quads, hip flexors, etc. Because if those are super tight, we're never going to get into the optimal position that we're looking for. So we need to clean up the parts first. Second, we're going to talk about positions. Now, when we're talking about positions, we need to look at what exercise we're going to be doing in our lift. So if we're going to be squatting, we need to look at a bilateral pattern. Now, can you use an asymmetrical or a split stance pattern to help a bilateral pattern? Absolutely, but specificity is king. So when we are getting into a position, it should be a bilateral position. And then lastly, once we get into that bilateral position, then we can start prying. And when it comes to prying, guys, there isn't any sets or reps here. I want you to get into the position and I want you to explore the position. You're going to be firing some muscles, you're going to be shifting your weight, you're going to be rocking back and forth. Really what I want you to do is explore the space. The only rules are don't move into pain and don't overdo it on day one, okay? Don't spend 30 minutes trying to pry. You're going to be super sore. So follow the step-by-step process and see how it goes. Now we're gonna head over to the gym floor in a second here, and I'm going to give you my favorite progressions for each pattern, but just remember, you can use whatever you'd like, and just make sure that you follow the system. So the first pattern that we're gonna look at is the squat pattern, and we're gonna dive right in. Now I'm gonna give you a handful of my favorite exercises that seem to work well for me, but for also the majority of my clients. Now, when we do these progressions, guys, I'm not really worried about sets and reps per se. You don't have to do 12, you don't have to do 14, you don't have to do 16, you don't have to do 20. What I want you to do is just to start getting acclimated to how things are feeling, but also how things are moving. Because maybe you need 20 reps, but if you stop at 10, well, giving you sets of 10 is not going to be effective. So with that being said, spend a little bit of time, because remember, if you want to improve your movement quality, you actually have to work at it. So we're going to dive right in. The first thing we're going to do is do an ankle glide. We're just going to try to clean up that anterior ankle joint. I like to start with my foot approximately maybe 3 inches from the wall. When we're doing these, make sure that we keep a little bit of an arch in the foot, because we don't want to pronate, we don't want to glide our ankle over our big toe. So we want a little bit of an arch, we want the heel glued down, and we want to aim our kneecap over approximately the middle toe, the fourth toe, and the fifth toe. And I'm actually going to be going over each one to make sure that we can optimize function on that side. Now, when we do this, we're going to do what we call sweeps and bumps. What do I mean? Is sometimes we're going to be doing larger, bigger movements, and these are my sweeps. And then some of the times we're going to work end range, and once we hit end range, we're just going to bump a little bit. So I'm going to take you through it. So from here, I'm going to use the wall for assistance. And again, I'm going to move a little bit further back because I do actually have decent ankle mobility. So I'm going to keep the heel down, and I'm going to aim my knee, again, over the middle toe. And then I'm going to aim it over the fourth toe, and then over the pinky toe. Now, like I said, these are the larger sweeps. Sometimes I'm going to hit end range, and I'm just going to start bumping a little bit and just working on that end range. And those are my basic ankle glides. I'm going to hit the same amount of time on both sides. Now, if one ankle is a little bit more gunked up, just spend a little bit more time there. So the first one is ankle glides, and then from there we're going to do a drill that we call, it's a calf stretch with a posterior weight shift. Not only will this open up the calves and really address kind of tissue length on the lower limb, you're going to get a lot of just improved mobility in the posterior chain. So when we do these, Hands are going to be on the ground. Ideally, I want to try to get this heel flat. I drive up as high as I can on the tippy toe. I get my heel down, and then I weight shift backwards. So tiptoe, heel down, butt back. Tiptoe, heel down, butt back. And again, we're going to spend however much time we need. I tend to do anywhere from 15 to 20 of these on each side. So the next one we're going to go into is adductor rocks. Very, very simple exercise. Posture nice and tall. Okay, this back foot, I'm going to point in slightly. My outside leg, I'm going to think about pushing my foot out of the socket and keeping my foot straight. And then from here, we're just going to rock back and forth, okay? And when we do this, I want you to keep a tall spine for the duration. And again, if you need more of a stretch, simply think about pushing the leg out. And we're just going to rock back and forth. Sometimes people get a foot cramp here, so you may have to go up and extend the big toe a little bit. It doesn't matter. Really, the focus is going to be here. Another thing I like to do is as I sit back and as I feel a big stretch, I'm going to fire my quad nice and hard, and you'll actually get a nice little extra stretch there as well. So I'm going to fire the musculature into this position as well. And we talked about that earlier. We may ask you to fire specific muscles to get into a better position. So these are our basic adductor rocks. From here, we're going to go into our 90-90 sequence, and I'm a huge fan of this because we can check off a lot of boxes, and it's very, very simple to do. So we're going to start off in a 90-90 pigeon. So we're going to get nice and tall with our posture, and right leg is in front of me. We've got a right angle, our 90-degree angle here, and approximately our right angle here. First thing I want you to do for the pigeon is to spiral up tall, and the cue that I like to give is we're going to hinge forward so the distance from your tailbone to your chin is as long as possible. And then we're gonna lean forward, and we can move a little bit. You can shift your torso more towards your shin, maybe more towards your knee, and maybe even out over your quad a little bit. But again, we're gonna get into the position, and we're simply gonna start moving in and out. We're gonna change angles and then go from here. Now, the biggest issue I see with the pigeon stretch is simply people round their back, and they're trying to chase a stretch. This is usually people that are very, very mobile, is they just try to round. And when you do that, you're really not addressing the hip, you're just moving into lumbar flexion. So from here, once we've addressed the pigeon, which is hip external rotation, we're gonna move to a little bit of internal rotation. Now, I am gonna give you two options here. If you already have decent enough passive internal hip rotation, you can do some active internal hip rotation here. When we do that, we're gonna spiral real tall. I'm gonna actively push into the ground with this hand. I'm gonna push into my shin here. I'm gonna bury my knee into the ground, and I'm gonna actively move my hip into internal hip rotation. Okay? This is a little bit of a butt cramper. The goal is not to cramp, but again, when you isolate that position and you move into internal hip rotation, you might get a little cramping. Now, if you do not have adequate active mobility in that position, you can simply use a band, and you can give it a little bit of assistance. So once we're here, what I'll do is I'll simply pull it over, a little bit of attention, then I'll actively pull. And the assistance of the band is just a nice way to give you a little bit more range of motion. So this is just helping us with passive mobility. But once you can do this and you can start to assist your hip into internal hip rotation, get rid of this and start doing it actively. Simple, simple, simple. And then lastly, from this 90-90 position, we can go into a Bretzel 2.0, which is named after a good friend of mine, Brett Jones. We're gonna be nice and tall. My right leg is in front of me. I'm going to rotate to my right approximately 90 degrees. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actively push into the ground and lock both elbows, and I'm gonna cycle some breaths here. Big breath and then exhale. And I'm just gonna do a handful of those. If this is easy for you, go down to the forearms. And you can cycle a bunch of breaths there. The breathing is going to be really fantastic for improving that thoracic rotation as well. So we've covered ankle mobility, we've covered the adductors a little bit, we've looked at internal and external hip rotation, and now what we're going to focus on is getting into the right position, and that's just going to be a simple goblet squat. So we're going to use a light kettlebell here. This is 18 pounds. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm simply going to get into the bottom of the squat. Now what I like to do is I'll rest my elbows on the inside of my knees. And this is going to act as a counterbalance to enable me to get a little bit more of a vertical posture. Now that we're in our position, we're going to start prying. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my elbows and I'm going to push the knees outward. And essentially I'm trying to almost think about getting a straight line from my elbow through my wrist to the opposite side. It's not going to happen, but that's what I want you to envision. So we're going to pry a little bit and then we're just going to wiggle side to side. When we're wiggling, we're still driving our knees outward. I can weight shift. Look, I can even mobilize my ankle here. My left ankle, I can even mobilize my right. We can also do some curls from this position. That will help. And we can also do some press outs, etc. We're going to play in this position for maybe 30 seconds or so. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stand up, I'm going to shake it out a little bit, and then I'm going to repeat. So there you have it. We've addressed the parts. We've got into our position, and then lastly, we focused on prying. So simple recipe to improve your squat pattern. So let's dive into our second pattern, which is going to be our split stance or our reciprocal lower body pattern. Now, this could be a lunge, which means it could be a forward lunge, reverse lunge, it could be a split squat, it could be a rear foot elevated split squat, etc. It doesn't really matter, but we need to make sure that we are addressing hip flexion and extension at the same time on both sides. So some of these drills you've seen before. You may have even seen them just in the last video that I did on the squat. But again, it's important to understand how we need to address this. So we're going to start with the parts, then get into a position, and then start prying. So when it comes to ankle mobility, I gave you a couple different options. I gave you the ankle glides on the wall, which is a great option. I gave you the calf stretch with a weight shift. That's another nice one. And then in addition to that, what we can do is we could get into a half kneeling position. And what I like to do is I'll start with my leg in front of me, and we want to make sure that we're not striding too far, because if we stride too far, we're actually going to run into hip restrictions before we even get a chance to address the ankle. So what I'm going to focus on here is I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to get into what we call this open kneel position. I'm going to take my hand and I'm actually going to place it right on the ground. But the placement is my wrist is going to be basically behind or to the outside of my pinky toe. Why? So when we're mobilizing the ankle, we can do it with a nice arch in the foot and we're not moving into pronation again. So I'll start from here and I'm actually going to hinge. I'm going to place my hand here and I'm just going to do some basic bumps and sweeps. And again, I'm going to go as far as I can, bringing my knee over my toe, specifically over the third, fourth, and fifth toe. You can play with the positions a little bit. You can change how much pressure you put on it. It doesn't really matter, but that's a fantastic option. Another option for improving ankle mobility. Now, the one thing that people miss or skip when it comes to lunge patterns is they forget about extension of the toe. Now, specifically of the great toe, because if you've ever had turf toe or lacked extension of that toe, it's miserable. So I'm going to give you a simple little progression that you can use, and it should clean up a lot of that movement. Now, if you do have some bony adaptations that have taken place over time, this is not going to do a darn thing for you. But again, for those of you that have just, have a tight bottom of the foot, etc., this will help. So this is what I call a three-way toe position. Now, I'm going to be in this open kneel position, and each hand is going to be on either side of my foot. Now, I'm going to use as much ankle mobility as I can, and then I'm going to use my hands to support my body, but my knee is going to come over. I'm going to glide my knee over my big toe. I'm going to come back. I'm going to, again, utilize as much ankle mobility as I have over my middle toes, and then lastly, over my pinky toes. So I'm going to show you guys that from here. So if you look at the position, I'm going to go as far as I can, and I'm going to move this hand out of the way. So I'm using as much ankle mobility as I have right now, as you can see. From here, and I'll move this hand so you guys can see, I'm going to go all the way up, and I'm going to aim my knee over the pinky toes. I'm going to come back. I'm going to go to end range for my ankle, over the middle toe, and then lastly, over the big toe. And then I'm just going to be alternating between those positions. Very, very simple, super effective, but don't forget about the toes, especially in the lunges and the split squats, because when you're lunging and you're doing your split squats, you need to be able to drive up onto the toes, especially if you train barefoot or in minimalistic shoes. Now, if you've got these big honking shoes that protect your toes a little bit, not much of an issue, but if you are a grappler or someone that trains barefoot, this drill is a game changer for you. From there, we're going to go into a half kneeling hip flexor stretch, and then we're going to go into a couch stretch. So the first thing we're going to do is the half kneeling hip flexor stretch. Most important thing here is understanding how to perform a posterior pelvic tilt. For some people, it's going to take a long time. They don't even get it. It doesn't even register that they have to do that. But some cues that you could use. If you had a belt buckle, you're bringing your belt buckle up to your chin. Another cue that you could use is if you've ever seen a scared dog and their tail goes between their legs, that's another cue that you can use. But it's important to get into that posterior pelvic tilt to get the right hip flexor stretch, so we're not hyperextending our spine. So I'm going to get nice and tall. My shoulders are stacked directly over my pelvis. I'm going to start with a posterior pelvic tilt. I'm going to actively engage my glute from here, okay? Really going to tighten my butt. I'm going to lean into it, and I'm going to hold that stretch for maybe 8 seconds, actively squeezing the glute. You should feel a good stretch on the front, and I'm going to back off. I'm going to re-engage. I'm going to go back into that posterior pelvic tilt, and then I'm going to hold that stretch for another 8 to 10 seconds. How many sets and reps? It doesn't really matter that much as long as you're consistent, but I will say this, 1 or 2 is probably not enough, 20's too much. It's really what you need, okay? From that half kneeling hip flexor position, I'm going to go into a couch stretch. Now, if you move well enough, you can just simply grab the quad, square up, because this is going to want to rotate you, and you can do the same thing. A little bit of a pelvic tilt, you can lean forward and actively pull your heel towards your butt. Now, if you cannot get there, you can use a med ball or a couch, hence why it's called a couch stretch. But it's the same idea. Nice and tall with your posture, make sure everything is stacked, a nice little pelvic tilt, and then you can lean into that, but also once you get that stretch and get that positioning, you can actually almost push back away from the wall and your whole entire body will move from the wall. Really good quad stretch. So that's a nice way to address the hip flexors and the quads at the same time. Now lastly, we're going to go into our prying. So we did our parts, which were the ankles and hip flexors. Now we're going to go into the positions, and then we're going to go into the prying. Now the position and the prying, they're pretty similar because it's focusing on flexion and extension at the same time. So this is our half kneeling position, but I like to go right into this, what I call the hands to instep stretch. Some people call it the greatest stretch of all time. I don't care what you call it, but let's focus on it. We're going to put our hands to the instep, and I'm going to do this from a couple different angles. Now, a few things we can do here is, one, I want you to get your hips low and your chest up. From there, I want you to just rock back and forth. Okay? Really rock back and forth. You may even have this foot come off the ground a little bit to really open up the external hip rotators. That's fine. But what you can do is you can just play with this position. Another thing I like to cue here is trying to push this heel away from you and squeeze the glute. So again, we've done our prying side to side. We're going to actively push and squeeze the glute, get a big stretch, and then I'm going to slowly try to inch this leg further back, and I'm just going to do the same thing. So the position is, look, we've got a flexed hip, we've got an extended hip. And once we work on that flexion and extension-based pattern, then we're going to pry. And you can just spend a little bit of time here. Now, we'll do the other side for you. The beauty of this position is you can add in some nice thoracic mobility as well. So once we're into this hands to instep position, we've done a little bit of prying, we've played, then we can go into our rib pull. Now when we rib pull, here's what I want you to focus on. You're going to start with your hand on your rib. You're going to open up as far as you can. That's the first step. Step 2 is you're going to slide your hand on your rib cage and your scapula is going to move towards your spine. And then from there, that's all T-spine. And then lastly, you can address the glenohumeral joint. So when you're doing the rib pull, think about T-spine first, scapular positioning second, and then third, the glenohumeral joint. And then even here, you can start to move the arm around. You can reach overhead. You can side bend. And again, you're just playing with the position. So that's a nice way to focus on parts. The next position that we're going to focus on is the overhead press. Whether you're doing a barbell overhead press or a kettlebell overhead press, there's a few things that we want to focus on. So we're going to start with the parts, and then we're going to move into the position, and then lastly we're going to pry. So one of the exercises I want you to do is the Bretzel 2.0, and I actually covered that in one of my earlier videos, but I want to give you another one because there's a lot of nuances of this position. So this is what we call a side lying rib pull, but again, I want to dive in just a little bit deeper. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start in this pure side lying position. So you're in a straight line from your ear to your shoulder to your hip to your knee, all the way down to your ankle. Now, once we're in the stacked position, we're going to bring our top knee up, and we're going to flex the top knee up as high as we possibly can. I like to take my bottom arm and hook it through. You can also place a medicine ball here or a foam roller here. It doesn't matter. I like this because it really forces me to keep my knee above 90. Now, we want to keep the knee above 90, so when we start to do our rotations, we're not rotating from the lumbar. We tend to get more rotation from the T-spine. We're in this lumbar lock position. So we bring the top leg up, we anchor it into this position. Now, we're going to start with the rib pull. We're going to use a little bit of breathing. We're going to focus on scapular positioning, and then lastly, glenohumeral positioning. So ideally, we'd also put our head down on something to support our neck, but I'm talking to the camera right now. So from here, we're going to have the hand on the ribs, but I'm actually going to start bringing my hand all the way across the ribs and just setting my scap into retraction towards the spine. At this point, scap's not going to move, so we don't get any false sense of rotation. From this position, I'm going to breathe in. I'm going to exhale like Darth Vader. The breathing is going to facilitate the rotation. So I'm going to breathe in again. Little pause. So we're going to let the breathing help us with rotation. Lastly, our goal is to really get that shoulder towards the ground or anywhere from 3 to 5 inches from the ground. From there, we're going to start to do a little bit of movement of the glenohumeral joint. Now, don't do this prematurely. If you can only rotate your T-spine 5 degrees, don't start cranking on your shoulder. You want to clean up your T-spine rotation and extension first and then address the glenohumeral joint. So we come open, and then what we can really focus on is this nice diagonal pattern where we actively reach out. And what I like to do is from here, I'll bring my hand towards my butt. I'll basically flip my palm over and I'll pronate a little bit. And then I'm going to come back. Once I'm at about shoulder height, I'm going to rotate my palm upwards. I'm going to supinate, and then I'm going to go overhead. So this is just a nice little way to address the glenohumeral joint as well. Now, that really covers a lot of boxes, right? It allows us to mobilize the T-spine, and we start to work on good scapular positioning, and then lastly, we get to work on glenohumeral mobility. When it comes to position, I like to go right into this overhead position, and then we can start prying. So this is, again, one of those scenarios where the positioning and the prying is almost going to be identical. Now, when we do this, try to use something where you still have your feet on the ground. You don't have to actually hang, you want to unload. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to do a slight posterior pelvic tilt. Okay, I'm going to tuck my tail, and I'm just going to unload. Why the pelvic tilt? Because most people, when they go overhead, what do they like to do? They like to go into lumbar extension. So we want to lock that down into a nice posterior pelvic tilt. Again, we're going to do that tilt, and then what we're going to do here is I'm going to show you this quickly. We're just going to lightly rotate and pry our shoulders. We're going to rotate to the right, cycle some breaths, and then exhale, just like Darth Vader. But keep that pelvic tilt, okay? Keep that posterior pelvic tilt. And then I'm going to start to pry in the other direction. Notice I'm still using my feet. So again, we're going to basically deload and hang a little bit, but keep that pelvic tilt, add in some breathing. From there, we can actually bring the lower body into it as well. So in this position, I'm just going to move this back a tiny bit. We're going to unload again with a slight posterior pelvic tilt. Right leg is going to go forward. Left leg is going to go out and behind. And I'm going to reach as far back as I can with that foot, and then do a little posterior pelvic tilt and just cycle some breaths. Add in some nice torso rotations, some neck rotations, but let your body weight and a little bit of gravity do the work. So we're gonna pry in this position, and then we're gonna move back and we're gonna do the same thing. So left foot is forward, right leg is going to reach behind. And once we get that big stretch, we're gonna try to unload and hang. Cycle some breathing. Perform some torso rotations and some neck rotations. So there you have it. This little progression on the bar has been a game changer for myself and my clients. So even if this whole thing you think is rubbish, use this bar sequence because it's really gonna help open things up. So hopefully you found these little progressions I gave you helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.